And we're live. Hey guys.
Hey everybody.
Hi everyone. Oh my gosh, this is so cool. I never pressed live before. So while above is pulling up the Google Slides, the presentation, how are you guys feeling for the AP exam? I was asking in the chat, and you guys have been giving pretty okay answers. And also don't go crazy over your teacher's APUSH average score, because you might be a 1 out of like a million, like a star student. Okay, so let's get started. So we're really excited to be hosting night 3 of the 5 APUSH Crams of 2023. So today we'll be going over period 6 and 7. And remember, guys, to follow at Think Viable on social media. And there's so many challenges and such great content and so many good memes coming from Viable's Instagram and like TikTok and YouTube and everything. So please follow them on social media. Okay, so again, here is the cram schedule for today. Today's May 2nd. We're going over periods 6 and 7. And so this is pretty much the schedule and for today. And then remember, if you have any questions during the review, please ask in the chat. I, for myself, will be answering you guys in the chat. And our hosts are here to support you. And just remember to ask questions, as many as you can, in case our hosts who are elaborating on the information aren't able to get you right away. And how to make most of a cram finale. So, notes. Please take notes on some type of device on your computer or on a notebook. And don't try to write down everything, but maybe like try to write down questions or like a study to-do list or main ideas. And use the Cram Hub online. It has all the slides, review packets, and replays for you. And you could use the fileable study guides that are online and follow along. And then this group chat here, there's so many people on here, and they will all be sharing tips, tricks, and please participate and ask questions. And then use the Q&A tabs to get your questions answered. And then yes, we'll take breaks, and yes, the replay will be available, so you can watch every single event that we go through and replay till your AP exam. So again, just remember to be kind, be patient, be supportive, and we have the few more nights together before your AP exam, so we're so excited for you guys and wishing you luck. And then again, about the Instagram or TikTok, if you guys post using the hashtag #ViableCrams and you tag at ThinkViable in the post or caption, and then your account's like public and everything, and you could win $100 because Viable will be selecting winners throughout the week, throughout the next 2 weeks of cram finales, and they'll notify you from their account. And you could win by making really funny content or going viral about your Viable cram experience. So take it away, guys, and I'll go back to the chats.
Hi, everybody. So today I'll be presenting to you period 6, which will cover the Industrial Revolution, immigration and urbanization, and also the farmers and populism. So let's start. The big idea of the Industrial Revolution was that during that time, a lot of technological advances were happening, the opening of new markets and the pro-growth governmental policies encouraged the rise of industrial capitalism in the United States. So let's go deeper into this. Westward expansion. So after the Civil War, the government invested heavily in transportation and communication systems, which helped to connect different regions in the country and also create new markets. So one of the most important things that helped to spur this economic growth was the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act was established. It provided land grants and government loans to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads to build the Transcontinental Railroad. It helped spur economic development and also population growth in Western states because it really helped to reduce travel time between the East and West coasts. But of course, it wasn't all that great, and it also encouraged the oppression of Native Americans. So in 1864, we see the Sand Creek Massacre happening. A group of Indian tribes asked for peace and also camped on Sand Creek in Colorado. They were attacked early in the morning by a group of Colorado military. It resulted in killing and also scalping of nearly all of the tribe members, including women and also children. Also, Native Americans weren't super happy with the rapid settlement of the West, and they saw a threat to their way of life because of that. So they responded in creating the Ghost Dance, which was a religious movement that promised to restore Native American lands while causing the white settlers to disappear. But the US Army didn't like this movement, and in 1890, we see Wounded Knee Massacre happening. The army caught up with a group of Native Americans who were practicing the Ghost Dance. The situation quickly escalated, and US Army killed about 200 men, women, and children. But in 1890, we see the closure of the American frontier, or at least it was officially declared by the US Census Bureau. This marked an end to westward expansion and the settling of the Western territories. It allowed to focus the American society to focus mostly on urbanization, industrialization, and the development of new technologies and industries more rather than just expanding to the West. So the Gilded Age started. It spanned from the 1870s to 1890s. It was a period of rapid industrialization and economic growth in the United States. The country underwent a transformation from the agrarian one to a more industrialized economy, and new technologies and innovations were arising during that time, such as steel, oil, and railroads. It marked the rise of big business as well, and the emergence of the new class of wealthy individuals, which were known as robber barons. They were also usually monopolistic and exploitative. So let's go through the technological innovations. Some of the most important ones were the telegraph network. So by 1870s, it was in place almost on every continent already, and it revolutionized the way people communicated with one another. Also, Alexander Graham Bell invented telephone in 1876. It was another major breakthrough in communication. And of course, Thomas Edison's invention of the light bulb helped in the development of electricity as a practical source of power for lighting. And so those businessmen were using this innovation to their advantage, and a lot of different industries were developing during that time. We see the steel industry developing a lot, and Andrew Carnegie was one of the biggest people in this environment. So his focus was on improving efficiency and controlling the quality of the product at all stages of production. So this we know is called the vertical integration. So basically it's control of multiple stages of production and distribution within a single company. And it allows to control over raw materials, manufacturing, and distribution of a product. Rockefeller in oil industry used another type of integration, which was called horizontal integration. So that was a type that allowed to control different competitors, for instance, or multiple factories or retail outlets within a specific region or industry. And it was, again, another type of monopoly. Westinghouse was operating mostly in electricity, and he created the Westinghouse Electric Company with the inventor Nikola Tesla. They developed an alternating current motor that could convert electricity into mechanical power. And Vanderbilt was famous in his operations in railroads. He was a successful businessman and used his fortune to merge local railroads into the New York Central Railroad. Another idea that was developing during that time was laissez-faire. So that was mostly used by, popularized by Adam Smith. So the idea was that business should not be regulated by the government, but rather by the invisible hand of the law of supply and demand. And if it was this way, then businesses would be motivated by their own self-interest, and they would offer improved goods and services at lower prices. But the government still wanted to control some of the parts of the business. And in 1890, we see the Sherman Antitrust Act being passed, which was intended to curb the power of monopolies and trusts. And it was also the first federal attempt to regulate big businesses. The idea that is important to know for your exam in this period is social Darwinism. So that was basically the extension of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection in biology to the marketplace. And the idea was that concentrating wealth in the hands of the fit would benefit everyone. But of course, it wasn't necessarily the case. Another similarly sounding concept here is social gospel, but it's different than the social Darwinism idea. So social gospel was a religious and social movement, and it advocated for Christians to actively work to improve the lives of the poor and marginalized in the society. And another idea here is the gospel of wealth as well. So that was the term used to describe the belief that some of the wealthy individuals during the Gilded Age had. So the idea was that they had a moral obligation to use their wealth for the greater good. And it was popularized by Andrew Carnegie. It also helped to change kind of the view of those wealthy individuals from robber baron to more of a responsible and socially conscious member of society, but they were still exploiting the labor. And let's move to the next slide to discuss the labor in the Gilded Age. So a lot of people and workers started to form unions and labor unions, and some of the most important ones are the Knights of Labor, which was formed in 1869. It sought to unite all workers regardless of skill or occupation and improve their rights and conditions. And American Federation of Labor, AFL, was also emerged during that time. It focused on organizing skilled workers and negotiating with employers for better wages, hours, and working conditions. By 1801, it grew to be the largest labor union, and it had a significant impact on the labor movement during that time. But during the Gilded Age, the government always sided with the businessmen. So those strikes and also the unions had some of the problems advocating for their rights, but people still organized in different movements and strikes, and we see a lot of them happening during that time. So some of the most important ones are the Great Railroad Strike in 1877. It was a nationwide strike by railroad workers protesting wage cuts. In 1886, we see Haymarket Riot that occurred in Chicago, and so the peaceful labor demonstration turned into a violent one and resulted in the deaths of several workers and also police officers. In 1892, we see Homestead strike. In this one, the steel workers went on strike to protest wage cuts, and the strike also ultimately failed. And in 1894, Pullman strike happened. This was a nationwide strike by railroad workers protesting wage cuts again and poor working conditions. Basically, those strikes ultimately failed or put down by federal troops. That was mostly because the government was on the side of the businesses. All of these conditions resulted in the Panic of 1893. It was a severe economic depression that affected the United States and also parts of the Europe. In February of 1893, a panic suddenly hit the New York stock market, and it resulted in banks beginning to cut back on loans. Businesses were unable to get capital and also fell at a rate of 2,000 a day during the months of May. So at the end, it resulted in mass unemployment. And let's move to another idea that we will cover, the immigration and urbanization. The big idea here is, as the cities became areas of economic growth, a lot of people wanted to come and use this opportunity to create the new market. So they attracted immigrants from Asia and from Southern and Eastern Europe, and they transformed the urban and rural areas of the US and also changed a lot of social dynamics and cultural aspects of the country. So the nativism emerged, which was fueled by both economic and cultural forces. Some of the economic factors contributed to that because immigrants were perceived as the ones that competed for jobs and resources and didn't allow so much of the local population to take those jobs. And they were also often blamed for reducing wages and driving up the cost of living. The cultural factors were also in play here because the native-born Americans feared that large influx of immigrants would change the cultural fabric of the country and dilute the American identity. So people started to organize in some of the groups that would restrict immigrants coming to the country, and Immigration Restriction League was formed in 1894. It advocated for literacy tests and other restrictions on immigration. In 1882, we see the Chinese Exclusion Act being passed. It was a federal law that prohibited the immigration of Chinese laborers to the United States, and it was the first law implemented to prevent a specific ethnic group from immigrating to the US. It remained in effect for over 60 years. And also, so many people were coming to the cities, so it caused a lot of overcrowded places and some of the unsanitary conditions. And in 1870, the Tenement House Act was passed. The city of New York tried to reduce this overcrowded and unsanitary place, but then by requiring each bedroom to have a window and set standards for ventilation, light, and sanitation. But many immigrants still continued to live in such conditions. But settlement houses started arising as well. So those were the community centers that provided services such as education and job training to immigrants and working class families in urban areas. Some of the most famous one was the Hull House, established by Jane Addams in 1889. It also provided a lot of different services to the community, including nursery, gym, library, and others. Ellis Island was the island in New York Harbor that served as the main point of entry for immigrants to the United States from 1892 to 1954. Ethnic enclaves were forming, so those were the communities of a particular ethnic group that lived together in this specific area and also shared the cultural aspects together. And also muckrakers started arising. So those were people such as journalists and reformers. They tried to bring attention to the poor and dire living conditions. And so they started taking photographs, writing those journals, and just attracting the attention to it. Another very important case that you would want to pay attention to is Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. It was the Supreme Court ruling that basically ruled that segregation was constitutional under the doctrine of separate but equal. It basically allowed the government institutions to practice segregation. Let's move to the third idea that we have, the farmers and populism. So the idea here is many farmers responded to the increasing consolidation in agricultural markets, and they felt like a lot of rights and also business activities weren't really supporting their rights and work. So they tried to form different political parties that would call for bigger representation from the government and bigger support. So what happened? In 1862, the Homestead Act was passed, which was a significant piece of legislation that encouraged farming on the Great Plains by offering 160 acres of public land free to any family that settled on it for a period of 5 years. So it allowed many people and motivated many people to move to the West because they had this opportunity and wanted to take advantage of it. So it really helped to settle and just like develop the American West. But it also it increased the productivity in agriculture because many people were moving there, but it also led to lower prices for farm products, and many farmers began to see large corporations as the enemy. So they started organizing, and Grange movement was founded in 1867. It aimed to improve the economic and social conditions of farmers through education, cooperative efforts, and also political action. It sought to improve transportation and marketing for farmers' products and to provide mutual aid and support for its members. So another organization that was formed was Farmers Alliance. It was a political organization, and it grew to be one of the largest farmers groups ever, with the membership of over 1 million people. It played a major role in the populist movement of the 1890s, and it eventually merged with the People's Party or Populist Party. The Populist Party was also a political party, and it mostly included farmers in the Midwest. They wanted to get their voices heard in government, specifically involving price inflations, interest rates, and sharecropping issues. Also, another person that you would want to know here is the William Jennings Bryan. He was made famous for his Cross of Gold speech, attacking the gold standard, and he was very popular amongst the Democrats and populists. So that's an important figure that you would want to just know for your exam. In 1887, we see interstate commerce by railroad companies. It required that railroad rates be reasonable and just, and established the first federal agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission, to enforce the act and investigate complaints. So it really helped to prevent discrimination against small shippers and also farmers, and to ensure that rates were fair. But it was not super effective because the railroad companies still continued to use their influence over the commission. In 1890, we see the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. It caused the value of silver to drop and hurt farmers. In 1890, Ocala platform was happening. So many farmers' alliances were politically minded and lobbied state legislatures for regulations on railroad rates. And in 1890, people organized, farmers mostly, to discuss some of the requirements that they wanted from the government, and they advocated for direct election of US senators, lower tariff rates, gradual income tax, and others. It eventually led to the foundation of the Populist Party that we already discussed on the previous, or on this slide actually. But during that time, also the US government's treatment of Native Americans included the policy of forced assimilation, in which the government sought to assimilate Native Americans into white American culture. And in 1887, we see a Dawes Act being passed. It was a federal law that aimed to assimilate Native Americans into white American culture by redistributing native lands and confining them on to life on reservations. Also, New South is another aspect you want to know. So the South continued to struggle to find its new place in the country after the Civil War and Reconstruction. It struggled to rebuild, but it started to industrialize a little bit, though it still remained highly agricultural. And some of the concepts from New South you would want to know is the tenant farming and sharecropping. We discussed it yesterday actually, but I will just go over a little bit more here. So those were the agricultural systems in which the landowners provided resources to farmers in return for a portion of the profits the farmers make from their crops. So basically, many former slaves had no choice but to work as tenants for white landowners, as they could not legally own land and had to work for others. So I hope you found this helpful, and we can join the quiz and go over a little bit more on the topics discussed. Just join. You can scan the QR code, but I will also put the link to the chat. One moment. Okay, I put the link. One moment, give me 1 second. I will need to switch to the quiz. I'll put the music. 1 moment. Definitely will do it. I know you guys really like it. I'm not sure you can hear it now, but for sure when I start it, you will hear it. I'll just wait a little bit more for people to join, and then we'll start. I also really like the music of the quiz. Okay, I think I'll start. And then those that want to join, you can always join a little bit later. Do you hear the music? Because I don't.
No, I don't think so.
That's so sad though. Why is it not happening? I could hear it earlier. Sorry guys, I guess this will be without music. But one popular indigenous resistance movement was okay, ready? So it was the ghost dance. And you guys were super correct. The rain dance wasn't the resistance movement. It was still the dance that they used, like the cultural moment, but it wasn't for the resistance. The Little Big Horn and Wounded Knee were the battles, so it wasn't the movement again. Oh, now I can hear the music. Can you? Yes. Okay, perfect. Okay, let's do it. So, what was not an issue for farmers in the Gilded Age? It was not an issue. Access to land was not an issue. As we discussed before, the Homestead Act was there that gave 160 acres of land for those who wanted it. So that wasn't an issue there. Which act forced Native Indians to assimilate to American culture? So it was the Severalty Act. We just went over. It just basically tried to assimilate Native Americans into white American culture. The Homestead Act was about giving land. Interstate Commerce Act was regarding helping farmers to navigate, to like protect them from rates being unreasonable. Indian Removal Act wasn't about assimilation to American culture. Despite calls for a new South, what remained is the primary form of business in the South? So it was the agriculture, and you were 100% correct. You guys are great. What were ways that slavery was unofficially continued during the Gilded Age? Okay, so it was all of the above. All of these systems were basically keeping the slavery unofficially there. They were all similar, using crops. Yeah. Next question. Which case legalized segregation? Okay, the music. I don't know. It went somewhere, but you can do it. If you do it quickly, we'll move to the next question quickly. And you will hear music. Okay. So Plessy versus Ferguson. That was the correct answer, and you guys were very, very right. So others were not regarding this issue. Other cases were not about this issue. For instance, Marbury and Madison established the principle of judicial review, giving the Supreme Court the power to strike down laws as unconstitutional. Gibbons versus Ogden affirmed the federal government's power to regulate interstate commerce, and the other one established the federal government's power to regulate interstate commerce and struck down state regulations that interfered with that power. And you were super right. Let's move to the next one. Hopefully the music comes. It's here. All of the following were innovators except. So Charles Darwin. This one created the still making process, Graham Bell, the telephone, Edison light bulb, and Charles Darwin, how it was related to this period was the idea that only the fittest would be will survive. That was extended to the social Darwinism idea. Go to the next question. What is the term used for companies that practice buying out other rival companies at low prices and consolidating them to create a monopoly? So the horizontal integration, and you guys were also mostly correct. So vertical integration was not about buying different companies and rivals, but mostly about controlling different parts of the company. So different parts of the raw material, processes, and things of that sort. So within the company itself, free markets economics and laissez-faire were similar, but they were advocating for businesses not being governed by, like, not the government not being in power of businesses and not controlling them that much. Next question. Social Darwinists took up Darwin's language of evolution through natural selection to explain what? Review it. It was class divisions between the less evolved, poor, and the rich, and you were guys super correct. And I think that's the last question. Jane Addams worked in a Okay, let's review. And that's a settlement house. And the one that was super famous was the Hull House that Jane Addams founded. So, perfect. Let's end the quiz. One moment. Give me 1 second. I'll just share the slides again. Meanwhile, how are you guys doing? How do you feel about period 6? Hopefully good. Okay. So we will go over multiple choice questions and some of the tips for how to complete them, so it's easier for you to navigate your exam and multiple choice questions. And I recorded some of the videos that we can look, and hopefully it works. Let's see. That's part 1.
Hi everyone, I'm Lyubov, and I will be presenting to you the stimulus-based multiple choice questions and some of the tips on how to approach them.
Let me know whether you can hear
So my first tip on multiple choice questions would be, before reading the text, before even reading the source, I would suggest going and reading the questions that are related to the prompt itself. So for instance, in this case, what changes led to the inequality Carnegie described during the late 19th century? This is important, I think, and helpful just because you have more understanding of what exactly you need to look for in the text or the image. Also, it gives you more context on what they are asking, maybe potentially some timelines or some of the concepts that you are familiar with. So it's just easier to navigate the multiple choice questions in general if you read the question first. And then the second step would be to go and read the source. This is very, very important because even if you don't know what the text is about, if you don't understand necessarily all of the language or the ideas, if you look at the source, you will already know what it is about, like some of the concepts, some of the ideas, the timelines. This is very important to look at the source. So in this case, we have The Gospel of Wealth, written by Andrew Carnegie, 1889. This already gives you so much about period 6, because if you know what Gospel of Wealth concept means, and even if you don't know, Andrew Carnegie will give you this tip on the Gospel of Wealth idea. So this already gives you enough to answer the questions, and you even have more the prompt itself, the text. So you are already set up to succeed, and it's going to be great. So after you approach the questions and the source, note the timeline, then you can go and read the text itself and answer the questions. Also, you have only 1 minute to answer the question, so, and like read the text, right? So don't spend too much time on reading the text. If you don't understand some of the words or some of the ideas, that's okay. Just make sure to grasp the big idea and move on and answer the questions. So good luck on that, and I hope you find this helpful.
Okay, so that was part 2. We'll move to the next video.
Hi everyone.
Oops.
Hi everyone. In this video, I will go over some more tips on. Hi everyone. In this.
Oh my God, I'm sorry about that. So many hi everyone. Okay.
In the exam. So what I found super helpful when I was doing it was highlighting all of the ideas, words that I thought were important and that would help me to identify those beliefs or main ideas in the text. So that is helpful, I think, just because you have only 1 minute to answer the question. You need to read the prompt, the text itself quickly, and then sometimes when you do that, you can lose the main idea or the belief or what exactly the text was about, because you are under time pressure and you can just think about something else sometimes. So highlighting it allows you to go back to the text and instantly understand what exactly it was about, the ideas, the concepts that were important, and then you can answer your questions quicker. So just allows you to understand more context and to not forget your ideas, and also to not lose time. So let's just try it on the example, and potentially you will find it helpful and use it in your exam. First, let's go to the question and read it so we know exactly what it is about. What changes led to the inequality Carnegie described during the late 19th century? So here I would highlight late 19th century. This is crucial, I think, all the periods, the times, very important to understand exactly. This is crucial just because sometimes in the multiple choice questions, you have in those answers, right, the A, B, C, D, you have some of the ideas, the concepts, something of that sort that actually existed, right? It was happening in the US history and you know about that and you potentially remember about that. But then you understand that that was not during this century. It wasn't during those times. So it's easy to eliminate it and just go further. It doesn't confuse you. So very important to pay attention to the timeline. Another one, the Carnegie, the figure, the person, important. And the inequality, I guess that's the idea of this question. So I would highlight those 3 aspects. Then let's go to the source. The Gospel of Wealth, So let's highlight this, Andrew Carnegie again, and 1889, the timeline, super important. And the question, the text itself. The problem of our age is the proper administration of wealth, so that the ties of brotherhood may still bind together the rich and poor in harmonious relationship. I think rich and poor are important. The conditions of human life have not only been changed, but revolutionized within the past few hundred years. In former days, there was little difference between the dwelling, dress, food, and environment of the chief and those of his retainers. The contrast between the palace of the millionaire and the cottage of the laborer with us today measures the change which has come with civilization. So here I would highlight the chief and those of his retainers, the cottage of the laborer and the palace of the millionaire. So we see this idea coming up again and again, the contrast between the rich and poor. And again, if you know what the gospel of wealth concept is and Andrew Carnegie, you already understand what exactly this text is about. So those ideas, just highlighting, it allows you to go back, understand it, and to not spend more time on reading the text again and again. I hope you found this helpful, and this is what helped me during the exam. And good luck on your exam, and see you in the next video.
I guess by highlighting, I meant like underlining and just making sure you kind of put something in front of the ideas that you think are important. Okay, part 3.
Hi everyone, in this video I will go over another tip on how to approach your multiple choice questions, and this one will be directly related to how to pick the answer to your question. I found this especially helpful when, for instance, I didn't necessarily know exactly what the concept was about, or I didn't understand all of the ideas in the text, or the image was confusing, so things of that sort. So what is this tip about? Is about, instead of looking for the correct answer, looking at the ones that you can eliminate. So that is helpful just because when you look for the correct answer, sometimes it's harder to find one and you are not sure about what exactly you need to pick, especially when you are not sure about the text or the concept. So then you can be more sure about the specific answer that you choose if you know that the other ones are not a good fit to the specific text, the specific question. It's just builds more confidence for you to go further and be sure that you pick the one that you think is the right one. So how does it work? You can eliminate the answers based on, for instance, timeline. That's why I focus so much on looking at the specific century, the source, etc. So, for instance, sometimes happens that you have the answers that make perfect sense, they're logical, everything is right, but then you remember that actually we're talking about late 19th century, for instance, or it just doesn't, this concept wasn't yet introduced during that time, and it wasn't at that time at all, so you know exactly that you can eliminate that from this question. Sometimes also it happens that the language that is introduced in the multiple choice question is very similar to the one that you used when learning those concepts, so the ones that are used in some of the textbooks or some of the guides, etc. So you think that, oh, that's the one that I need to pick because that's the language, right, that I remember how it was described. Well, don't be fooled, and make sure to read all of the answers and just think about the logical explanation to the specific text, the specific image, the specific question, and that will really help you to pick the one that is really the one that they want you to pick. And so there are some answers like this. Just make sure to follow your logic, just make sure to actually read the text and the source and the question. So all of those are super important to eliminate the answers. And in the next video we'll go over all of the tips together and try to pick the answers to this specific text and these specific questions together, so we can see how it all works together and how you can use those tips in practice. Hi everyone, In this video, we'll go over all of the tips that were introduced in the previous videos and actually apply those in practice, focusing on this specific example. So let's dive into it. We already read the text before, so I will not do that again, but we can use the skill we learned on highlighting, right? So if you use that one, you can just go back to the text and see that you highlight wealth, rich and poor, millionaire and laborer, etc. So all of those ideas were actually noted by us in the previous videos, so we can directly understand what this text is about, especially a Gospel of Wealth, Andrew Carnegie, and late 19th century for sure. So let's go into the question. What changes led to the inequality Carnegie described during the late 19th century? A. Increasing prices for foods and goods. B. Increasing industrialization and economic consolidation. C. Emergence of a welfare state that encouraged laziness. And D. A widespread lack of education. So what can we eliminate? I think we can directly go to the answer C, emergence of a welfare state that encouraged laziness. I think that's a bold statement to especially describe the late 19th century. During that time, we see a lot of innovation coming, industrialization and urbanization, a lot of those things. So that's definitely not about encouraging laziness. We can eliminate that one. I think actually this example is better to answer like right away instead of eliminating the questions, just because it talks about industrialization, economic consolidation. We know about that from the late 19th century, period 6. But just to make sure, you of course can go to other questions and make sure they're not related. So A, increasing prices for food and goods. Actually, during that time, the prices for goods were like decreased a little bit, but it didn't make workers rich, so we would not choose this one. And then D, a widespread lack of education. It wasn't the case. By late 19th century, the literacy was quite widespread, so we wouldn't choose this. But B, yes, it really connects to it. The industrialization created working class that really depended on wages, and businessmen consolidated all of the wealth.
Okay, you guys, some ask for slower and some ask for speeded up version, so I will just keep it at 1.25.
In their hands and created trusts and restructured financial aspects to actually benefit them. So that's what we would choose. Let's go to, we have answer B, and the question 2 is, what did the Gospel of Wealth suggest as an answer to the inequality Carnegie observed? So A, poor people must pray for greater wealth and success. B, religious revivals must occur in order to end sin and create wealth. C, wealthy individuals must serve as role models and give lectures to the poor. And D, benefactors should use their wealth to create greater economic opportunity. So again, very important to look at the source. Andrew Carnegie, Gospel of Wealth. You can confuse it potentially with similarly sounding concept, social gospel, but social gospel is a religious movement, and Gospel of Wealth was introduced by Andrew Carnegie. And you can always use the text here to understand this concept, right? The rich and poor, and this contrast between each other. So this should lead you to the correct answer, and we could focus on C and D because the first one talk more about religious aspects and this is not the Gospel of Wealth. So C can sound very familiar and like wealthy individuals must serve, but then we see as role models and give lectures to the poor. That wasn't necessarily the case. Nobody was talking about giving lectures to the poor. It was more about using their wealth to create greater economic opportunity. And that's what Carnegie was talking about and the Gospel of Wealth was about. So we would use D, and that's the correct answer. So that's how you can approach your multiple choice questions. I hope all the tips were useful for you, and good luck on your exam.
Okay, perfect. That were the tips for multiple choice questions from me. I think we can take a break for a few minutes now, and then we'll practice those multiple choice questions from like exam type ones, not the quiz that we did before. And we will then pass and go to period 7. So let's take a break right now. The break, I think, will take like 5 minutes, 5-6 minutes. So you can drink water and just walk around the room. so you don't sit for 3 hours straight. Can you hear the music? I'll put the quiz music for the rest of the break.
I personally can't hear it.
You can? Oh no, I can hear it.
Well, I mean,
Okay.
can you hear it?
I can. But that's okay. Then no music for tonight's break. Okay, I think we can continue now. 5 minutes already passed. So let's start with our practice. Come back, everyone who went for water or something.
Hi, everyone.
No, we are not doing hi, everyone again. We are practicing multiple choice questions. So that's the first one that we have. And you can read everything, the source, the question, and also the prompt itself. And then let me put up the poll. So everyone can answer whatever, which one they think is the appropriate one. One moment. Okay. Can you see the poll? I see you're putting it in the chat, but you can also use the poll if you want to. Okay, you guys are like so good at it. So let's reveal the answer, and the answer is C. I see from the poll that everyone was correct. So the Populist Party supported more governmental regulation of the economy, including owning railroads and communication systems. And those, like, they opposed governmental regulation, and it was antithetical to the Populist Party. So they felt it created too much inequality. And the answer is C here. Yeah, it reinforced the gold standard that wasn't right, because the gold, they, like, farmers were not really into that, promoted competition, not necessarily anti-Republican. Also, like, answer C is the most correct one. If you are using the elimination process, that would be the one that you would choose. Okay, next, let's move on to this one. That's the same prompt, but different question. What was the most common method workers used to confront business owners and managers during the late 19th century? So I can create a new poll, or you can put it into the chat, the answers that you have. I think let's use poll, right? Oh, but don't use the one that, oh, you will just re-vote, basically? No, don't use the one that you already used. I'll just create a new one. Okay. Let's vote in the poll which one, part 2. Okay, I see that you are answering A, and some of you put in the chat also D, so we'll go over it now. So the answer is A. They formed labor unions and called for strikes. So that was what we went over also in the session. The farmers started forming, and workers started forming labor unions, and they started being super aware about their class identity. They organized strikes, which led to armed conflict with private detectives, police, and soldiers. So examples that we discussed were the Great Railway Strike, Homestead Strike, Pullman Strike, and others. So that would be the answer. Okay, the next one. Here we are using the image. Should I create, or will you just revote? Guess let's just put it in the chat. Let's just use the chat for this, for the next ones. Okay, I see the answer is B, D. What do we have more? D, D, B, D. Okay, let's see. Let's see what it is. And it's D, the increased political influence of corporations and special interests. I see that you are asking why not B. B would not be here. It's a distractor because it's not directly, the political machines are not directly like depicted in the cartoon here. They're strongly related to like the monopolists at the time, but it's not necessarily that is shown in the image. So that would be D. And others are not related. Women's lack of political power in the 18th century, not related to the cartoon. Divisiveness of party politics following the Civil War. Again, it's not addressed in the image. So we have D if we were using the elimination process. But if not, it's also, we see this robber barons that were mentioned before, and that's exactly what it is, the corporations and special interests and monopolies. So let's move to the next one, and the same, we're using the same picture but different question. Which of the following did not represent a challenge to the ideas expressed in the cartoon? So let's put your answers in the chat. Okay, it's overwhelmingly B. Let's see what the right answer is. And you are right, guys, it's horizontal integration. So the question is what did not represent a challenge to the monopolists, right? What is represented in the cartoon, and all of the others, the horizontal integration did not represent the challenge because that was one of the ways the monopolies were created. Again, horizontal integration is when you are buying different, like your competitors or a lot of factories in the same region or in the same industry. So it did not represent the challenge to it, but others represented the challenge. So People's Populist Party farmers were not super happy with the governmental policies, unionization. It was also one of the ways to protect rights of workers, so it went against the monopolies. The social gospel saw capitalism as the driving force behind urban poverty and class inequality, so also is not the correct answer. Let's go to the next one. So you can read the prompt. Chinese Exclusion Act 1882. The question is, why did congressmen enact the Chinese Exclusion Act? Again, put your answers in the chat. Okay, I see all the C's here. Let's see what's the right answer. And you're right again. So they wanted to reduce economic competition from Chinese laborers. So a lot of Chinese workers came to the US in search of economic opportunities. They took many low-paying jobs, such as railroad construction, and that's why, like, a lot of economical factors influenced this competition, and also the cultural tensions caused many politicians to express racist opinions about Chinese immigrants during that time, and it resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act. And we have another question here. Which of the following characteristics of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe did not contribute to cultural tension after they arrived in America in the late 19th century? Put your answers in the chat. Okay, so I see again C in the chat. Let's see what it is. And you are again right, it's C. Immigrants unanimously supported temperance laws, so it did not contribute to cultural tension after they arrived in America. So basically, all the others contributed to the cultural tensions: the religion, the language that they spoke, and also the like cuisine and other customs. All of those contributed to the cultural tension, but not necessarily their ideas about the temperance laws. And we have another one that's one of the last ones, so work on it. And it's a letter by Harry Shirley, a member of the Caddo Indian tribe, who attended the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1882. And the question is, which of the following statements best describes the status of Native American tribes in the late 19th century? Put your answers in the chat. Okay. I see that you are answering D. And which one is that? Right, that's D. The US government no longer treated the tribes as sovereign unions and forced them onto modest reservations. So there was the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871 that said that tribes were no longer sovereign and Congress did not have to negotiate with them. And also the Dawes Act of 1887 provided families 160 acres of land and tried to open up millions of acres for white settlement. So you were absolutely right. And I think you're going to do great on your multiple choice questions, especially for period 6. And right, that was the last practice that we will have for multiple choice questions. And now is the time for Q&A. I think we have a few minutes for that, and then we'll move on to period 7. You guys did a great job with your multiple choice questions. Okay, I see some of the questions regarding the Grange movement. So Grange movement was founded in 1867, and it tried to improve the economic and social conditions of farmers through education, cooperative efforts, and also the political action. So they wanted to, it was like a fraternal organization for farmers, and it was formed to provide a sense of community among farmers and to organize resistance efforts regarding, like, against the monopolistic efforts that were there, especially for railroads and grain elevators and other large corporations. So that was basically the movement against those cooperative or like monopolistic organizations. So for the social gospel and gospel of wealth differences, so the gospel of wealth was popularized by Andrew Carnegie, and it was basically the idea that the wealthy individuals have some moral, like, obligation to use their wealth for some greater good and to I don't know, like open libraries or anything of that sort. And so they just needed to use their wealth for something greater, right? For people, a bigger population of people. And the social gospel was the religious movement that advocated for Christians to work to improve the lives of poor and marginalized in the society. And it was like also call for social justice. So basically the idea was that they both kind of wanted to help those, not wanted, but the idea was to help those marginalized in the society. But when the first one, or social gospel, was mostly about like to work to improve the lives and for Christians to do that, then the social gospel of wealth was for wealthy individuals to do that. Okay. I think we can pass it to Deniala for period 7.
All right. Let me just try to move on to the stage. Are you screen sharing?
Yes.
Okay.
Am I not screen sharing?
No.
Right now, can you see my screen?
I can't see it right now, though.
Okay. Try to do it again. Okay. Can you see it now?
Okay, I can see it now.
Okay, perfect.
All right, you guys. Today we're gonna go over period 7. So, like, literally, don't fall asleep yet, because it's like one of the biggest periods. It covers imperialism all the way to the New Deal and World War II. So, like, be ready. All right. First off, I want to preface by saying that in this time, the United States grows into its role as a world power in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The growth was driven by a number of factors: the country's vast natural resources, rapidly expanding industrial base, and growing population. And the United States played a key role in World War I and II, and which helped establish it as a major power in a global stage. In the post-war period, the U.S. continued to assert its economic and political influence around the world, and by the mid-20th century, it became one of the two most dominant superpowers in the world, along with the Soviet Union. On the test, you'll be asked to explain the context in which America grew into its role as a world power. All right, we can move on to the first slide now. Okay. So this is what I like to call imperialism light. The Spanish-American War is really like one of the starts of the US imperialism. So it all starts in like the 1890s, where you have the growing wave of jingoism, which is an intense form of nationalism calling for an aggressive foreign policy. Think like, remember when we learned about Manifest Destiny and all of that? Soon after we kind of conquered the whole frontier, we all started to think in our heads, what other frontiers can we conquer? And we got our answer in the Spanish-American War. Okay, so I want to explain the Cuban Revolt or the Cuban Rebellion. I'm not exactly sure how you've learned it, in 1895. So the U.S. saw Latin America and the Caribbean as its zone of authority. Think like the Monroe Doctrine, right? And the U.S. was growing increasingly uneasy about the Cuban Rebellion against the Spanish. Cuba was close to Florida and frequent target of like all those businessmen who like wanted to produce sugar and tropical crops. You know what I mean? So a Cuban rebellion was formed against the Spanish, which began to sabotage and lay waste to Cuban plantations. They used like a scorched earth hit and run policy to just force the Spanish to leave, and they hoped to either force Spain to withdraw or to pull the USA in as an ally. In response, Spain sent this general, Valeriano Weyler. Again, his name isn't really important, but what he does is important. He was known as the Butcher, and he is infamous for his brutal tactics in the Cuban War of Independence. He had a policy called reconcentration, which moved the native people into camps. And in these areas, Cubans died by the thousands. Unsanitary conditions, overcrowding, and disease. He also forced civilians into camps. Yeah, they forced civilians into armed camps where all these people died of disease, which earned him the title of the Butcher in the American press. So now we're going on to like yellow journalism, and I like to think of it as like Facebook news. You know how you go on Facebook and there's like all these outrageous news articles? That's kind of like how it was in this period. So to keep like an eye on the Spanish, President William McKinley, who is the president at this time, remember that, sent the U.S. battleship U.S. Maine to the Cuba's capital city, Havana. While it was docked, it blew up during the night. There are so many investigations and it was likely an accident, but the United States blamed Spain, and aided by its like war fever, whipped up by yellow journalism, which falsified news stories aimed to increase the circulation of newspapers. The United States rallying cry was the "Remember the Maine," and pro-imperialists like Theodore Roosevelt used it as a rallying cry. Remember the phrase you've all learned, "Remember the Maine," and all of that. And then another part of and what also led us into the Spanish-American War was like a little private letter sent from a Spanish ambassador to the United States to a friend, which he referred to, and I quote, President William McKinley as weak and a would-be politician. Now, this was like absolute ammo back then. So it was letter was stolen and published, and you'll see this as a common theme. Nobody can keep their letters to themselves. So, and that letter also became a rallying cry that further fueled tensions between like the two countries. And the publication of the Delome letter played a role in the United States' decision to declare war on Spain in 1898. This is when William McKinley declares war. In his message to Congress, he said that he yielded to public pressure and sent a war message. He had the 4 reasons for the U.S. to intervene in the Cuban Revolution on behalf of the rebels. It was to 1, end starvation in Cuba, and most interestingly, I find, to protect the lives and property of U.S. citizens living in Cuba, and to end the serious injury to the commerce, trade, and business of the American people, and end the constant menace of peace rising from disorder in Cuba. And do you realize how many of those are like economic reasons? Keep that in mind as we go forward and when we talk about the pro-imperialism and anti-imperialism. Okay, now we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so responding to the president's message, Congress passed a joint resolution, and part of this resolution was the Teller Amendment, which declared that the U.S. had no intention of taking political control of Cuba, and that once peace was restored to the island, the Cuban people would control their own government. And then the Teller Amendment was modified by the Platt Amendment, which put conditions under which the U.S. would leave Cuba. That it also permitted extensive U.S. involvement in Cuban international and domestic affairs for Cuban independence. In the aftermath of the war, the United States took Philippines, Guam, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, and for good measure, we also took Hawaii because it was not only a good source of sugar, coaling station. We all love pineapples, so they really wanted them pineapples, really. And the Philippines were a stop on the way to China, which was a potentially huge market into which like U.S. producers were eager to get involved. If we're going into like resistance against American imperialism, we have the Filipino-American War, where the Filipino nationalists that had partnered with the U.S. to defeat the Spanish wanted independence, but the U.S. said, "Nuh-uh, I don't think you're ready for that. I don't think you're ready to rule your own government." And as you can see, fighting soon broke out. The Filipino-American War lasted to 1902 and took the lives of thousands of soldiers and civilians on both sides. The Filipinos used guerrilla tactics to resist the better-equipped U.S. military. So the U.S. responded to more horrific tactics, including an early version of waterboarding and anti-civilians measures, which killed like 200K people. It was a nasty war and showed like the worst sides of like the U.S. imperialism. If I would use one of these examples, like both of these examples, like the Filipino-American War and the Boxer Rebellion, which I'm about to talk about, as like examples of resistance to a U.S. imperialism. So once the United States had control over Hawaii and the Philippines, it became increasingly active in Asia. It engaged with China through helping other European powers put down the anti-Western Boxer rebellions in 1899. And the U.S. supported the so-called open door policy in China so that countries like the U.S. were free to trade with China without interference with the European American powers. Okay, we can move on to the next slide now. Oh, see, I heard somebody talking about diplomacy. All right, so we got the 3 diplomacies of the period. You're gonna have to remember these because these are very important for understanding how U.S. foreign policy evolves. So Teddy Roosevelt had the big stick diplomacy. Speak softly, carry a big stick. He built the reputation of the United States as a world power, and imperialists like worshiping his every move. They loved Roosevelt. They loved him. There was Taft's dollar diplomacy, which is probably one of the most American things I've ever seen. It's literally just throwing money at the problem. He spent more investors' dollars on Navy's battleships. There's a specific document that says that specifically says oh, we have to expand the Navy in order to protect our United States power. And his policy promoted U.S. trade by supporting American enterprises. Remember this, dollar diplomacy. It also has alliteration. So, and then we have Wilson's moral diplomacy. He pushed for a more moral approach on foreign affairs. He opposed imperialism and the big stick and the dollar diplomacy policies, all of that. He believed in a principled, ethical world where militarism and colonialism and war were all brought under control. He decided to use more peaceful powers and diplomatic approaches into getting what he wanted. Okay, move on to the next slide. So now we're getting into the imperialism debates of the period. So Americans who favored expansion and imperialism, the pro-imperialists, which imperialism, by the way, is the control over another group of people, usually without their consent, mostly without their consent. And they relied on the following arguments. 1, they saw economic opportunities and benefits to conquering places like Cuba and Hawaii and the Philippines, and they were useful for naval bases and growing tropical cash crops. They also, they were seen as important coaling stations, steamship stopping points, and important connections between the United States and the large market of China. Pro-expansionists also argued that this is one of the religious arguments tied to social Darwinism, that argued that Anglo-Saxons, or the super white Northern Europeans, who were Protestant, democratic, and morally and spiritually and more advanced than the other nations of the world. You can hear the hoity-toity laugh as I am saying this. So they deserve to displace the Spanish, who were Catholic and dark and less democratic than us, and ruling over places like the Philippines, who were heathen and tribal. The pro-expansionists also cited competition with Europeans as a reason to expand. I'll slow down. They argued that the United States needed to keep up with the Europeans, who were experiencing a second wave of imperialism to become and stay a major world power. And the U.S. had just finished with Western expansion. By 1890, which is the beginning of this period, the frontier was non-existent. After you finish California, what's next? So imperialists argued that the frontier was necessary, that it was a necessary escape for people who did not like U.S. civilization. And the frontier offered a rugged, dark cowboy place where the United States could just rough it in the dirt. It offered a place where the United States could enhance and refine its manly virtues through warfare and battles with nature. You can hear Roosevelt cackling in the background. He loved this. He loved this idea. They also wanted these frontiers in overseas places like the Philippines. The anti-imperialists, so I'm going to say a few names, Andrew Carnegie and Mark Twain. Mark Twain, remember the guy who wrote Tom Sawyer, the book you all had to read and hated? Yeah, that guy. They had 3 different arguments for why. 1, self-determination. The U.S. had once been a colony itself, right? And these anti-imperialists opposed the American annexation of the Philippines because the language of self-determination had already been a part of U.S. political conversations. like showing the importance of voting and becoming your own person, etc., etc. Consent of the governed. Come on. Like, how can the United States go against our Lord and Savior, John Locke? There was also some like racial reasons for why people did not want to expand. Some objected into adding more non-white people to the US because these individuals could never possibly cannot properly assimilate into American society. They believed that they would not be capable of participating in United States democracy or striving for these US ideals and values. And finally, the anti-imperialists also argued that the United States had a long tradition of isolationism. Okay, a long state of isolationism dating back to the Washington administration. They did not want to get involved with overseas quarrels needlessly. Like, they were in the whole camp. Remember when Washington wrote his final address and warned about this? Yeah. All right. So the argument saw that the United States was largely sufficient and viewed the expansion as opening like a possibility for dangerous vulnerability, that the US would be closer to competing with its powers that will need to expand its military defensive and even larger far-flung territories. Okay, can we pause for a moment? All right, let's go. Right, next slide. So now we're getting into like the progressive era. So we all remember how like the Gilded Age was kind of corrupt. It was gilded in gold when actuality there was like a dark core in the center. The progressives were the people who tried to clean all that up, right? Many of the reformers were journalists. They were called muckrakers, which because they sought to expose the areas that needed reforming via magazines and newspapers. I'm just gonna go down this list, and then we'll get to like the meat of the issue. So we had a Tarbell, the Standard Oil and Rockefeller Trusts. We had Stephens, who battled Boss Tweed and political corruption. We had Upton Sinclair with food safety, who wrote the Jungle. Jacob Riis, is it Reese or Riss? I have no idea. But he opposed the tenements and exposed them in the book. Exposed them. It was photography. The other half lives, which were poorly made, crowded apartments. Like, let's say half of New York City. There was also Jane Addams who tackled immigration via the whole settlement house, and Margaret Sanger, who provided birth control for women, or really the lack thereof of birth control for women. I want to talk about how these effects of these muckrakers actually translated into political laws and such. Like the Jungle, which was originally an anti-capitalist book, but people were more concerned about how disgusting these factories were. So we made the Pure Food and Drug Act, and it led to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. And I want to mention how Jane Addams' Whole House led middle and upper class, college-educated, often white women who made large portions of the progressive movement move into immigrant neighborhoods and open up social welfare organizations, which was the beginning of the social worker profession, and provided social services, child daycare, kindergarten classes, English classes, citizenship training, etc., etc. And they also wanted to help immigrants assimilate into American urban culture and deal with poverty. But of course, there are also racial divisions amongst the progressives. Like some progressives supported the Southern segregation of African Americans. I want to emphasize that not all of these progressives were good. They were not all anti-racist. Some of them still had racist ideas on how they implemented their policy. Some people fought against it, like Ida B. Wells and her anti-lynching muckraking. And even the progressive that offered to help immigrants often favored racist immigration restrictions or literacy tests. to make sure that racial minorities and immigrants could not vote, so that the government would be controlled by experts, which were Anglo-Saxon, native-born Americans. And also some progressives, some progressives disagreed in their approach to Africans. Think the disagreements between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington was one of the leading leaders of the African American community in South, and had the Atlanta Compromise speech that stated that Americans should work first for economic success and then wait for social equality. Right? It was more like, you know how people say like, oh my God, Beyonce's so rich, she's bringing up Black people. He was kind of like that. And then W.E.B. Du Bois, he was a leader who insisted upon social equality for the African American community to rise up and show white people what African Americans were capable of accomplishing. He founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, an organization still fighting for Black rights to this day. Okay, now we can go on to the next slide. All right, so now we're going to talk about some of the political changes we saw in the progressive era. So we saw like the beginning of these. Oh my God. Okay, so we have the amendments. We have the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th amendments. The 16th fought for income tax for the wealth inequality we suffered in the Gilded Age. The 17th, which allowed for the direct election of senators, which also fought the political corruption in that time. The 18th Amendment was the prohibition of alcohol, though it was later repealed with the 20th Amendment. And we also saw progressives in the government, like when we saw with Roosevelt's Square Deal. Roosevelt was elected following the assassination of William McKinley in 1901, and he insisted on a square deal for labor and business. It included 3 parts: consumer protection, business, labor, and regulation. This includes the trust busting. Remember the trust busting, and conservation efforts. So this was the creation of the EPA, not the EPA, the National Park Service and the National Forest Service and whatnot. There was also the Pure Food and Drug Act, which regulated the safety of food and prescription drugs, or the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, which was extremely important. It strengthened the federal government's oversight for businesses and to reduce trusts and monopolies, which added more enforcement to this Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. There were also there's also things in voting, like what we saw in Follett's Wisconsin idea, which allowed for all of these new voting reforms, like the Australian ballot, where it stopped all the political parties manipulating and intimidating voters by printing lists of party candidates and watching voters just drop them in the ballot box of election day. No, sir. In the new model it's called the Australian ballot because it was modeled after Australia. Issued ballots printed by the state, requiring voters to mark their choices within a private booth. There was direct primaries, placing the nominated process directly in the hands of the voters. So no more backdoor meetings with politicians. There was the referendum and the recall. The referendum, where voters could undo an act of state legislator through enough votes, and a recall, which voters can remove politician earlier from office and earlier than their a term expiration date. And we also saw that how we controlled most of our public utilities. By 1915, 2/3 of our nation's cities own their own water systems. They came to own and operate gas lines, electric power plants, and urban transportation systems, which did make the cities a lot cleaner and a lot more well-regulated. And we cannot forget the conservation efforts like John Muir and his Sierra Club, which fought for the preservation of preservation of wilderness areas. And we also saw under Theodore Roosevelt the creation of national parks. And presidents like Roosevelt and Wilson created agencies like the National Forest Service and the National Park Service, respectively. Okay, we can move on to the next one. Wait, I'm breaking up? Is that just one person? Am I okay? Okay, all right. All right. So we're gonna go over Taft's presidency. He was William Howard Taft. Look him up. He is like one of our drippiest presidents. Anyway, he was in Roosevelt's cabinet as a Secretary of War. He was a big trust buster and ended double the number of trusts than Roosevelt. But he also had a little dispute with Roosevelt when one of these trusts he broke up. One of these trusts he broke up actually was one Roosevelt signed off on. So Roosevelt got up from his retirement home and ran again for the fourth term. Right, he ran again for the fourth term. Sorry, he ran again for the third term, and this starts the election in 1912, where in one corner we had the Progressive Party, where some anti-Taft and progressive Republicans came forward and nominated Roosevelt. This was the Progressive Party. And then this party would then be known as the Bull Moose Party. And then Theodore Roosevelt, oh my God. Sorry. And then Woodrow Wilson won with the Democrats. And he won 2 million votes over Roosevelt because the Republican vote was largely divided. I'm pretty sure there's some maps that would tell you this on I remember getting like a practice SAQ on how the maps were divided in this area. So be warned, because you might be asked about this. It might be a little niche, but the election in 1912 is important. Remember it. So Woodrow Wilson had this progressive program, which he called the New Freedom, because Americans cannot stop without putting the word new or freedom or eagle or anything or democratic in any of their policies. They can't resist it. So his policies emphasize business competition and strong and small government, reigning in federal authority, and it really largely echoed Progressive Party's social justice objectives. He also had some tariff reduction, like the Underwood Tariff Act passed in 1913, which lowered the tariffs. And there's also the Banking Reform Act. There was the Banking Reform, which was the Federal Reserve Act. And then there's also the Clayton Antitrust Act, which strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act for breaking up those monopolies. Hold on. Okay, now we can move on. So now we're moving on into World War I. Please, if you weren't paying attention before, pay attention now. World War I will almost always be on it. You will get a question, no doubt about it. The boba sip is not scripted. So for the causes of World War I, Fiveable says, I remember it from Fiveable because they had a nice acronym for it. It was MANIA. First, militarism. Countries were building up militaries in an arms race. And then we had the alliances. So you know how every country had an alliance with each other. Every country had friends, so conflict could easily spread. And then there was nationalism, where each country thought they were the best and all the other ones were evil. And we had imperialism, where the European countries not only thought each other were evil, but also wanted each other's territory. And then all ended with the assassination of Austria-Hungary's Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which sparked war because of all the underlying tensions above. So you need to know the central powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And then we have our allies, which is Serbia, France, Great Britain, Russia, and later the United States. So the United States was like it was initially neutral, right? With a neutral with an asterisk. They were loaning a lot of money to allies, like almost $2.5 billion, then to the Central Powers, which are only like a measly 56 million. So this placed American interests primarily in the Allies and created like a political rift between the US and Germany in particular. So this, I want to stress that I did not mention this term. This was called loaning. This was specifically called loaning. Okay. And then we have the sinking of Louisiana, which is it's not funny, but the way the things unfold, it's comical. It's almost comical. So, although the British were stopping US troops for trying to trade with Central Powers using their navy, they usually confiscated and bought the trade goods. The Germans, by contrast, could not compete with the British Navy and relied on U-boats and submarines, which meant they attacked Great Britain bound goods from underwater, and they did not confiscate or compensate. So they often destroyed all of the boats. And the most famous incident was the sinking of the Louisiana in 1915, which killed 123 Americans. And this was one of the inciting incidents for why America joined World War I in the first place. The US didn't want to join the war at this point because the German apologized and told them, I won't sink another ship, but now we know that was a lie. Spoiler alert for anyone who didn't know World War I, that was a lie. So then we have the Zimmerman telegram, which again is another instance of people cannot keeping their letters in a safe space. Like, please, like, can you write in the diary? Thank you. It was a resumption. It was the Zimmerman telegram and the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. The Zimmerman telegram was a message from Germany to Mexico, decoded and shared by the British, that urged Mexico to invade the US and keep the US occupied in exchange for German support for Mexico, and then they can take parts back from the Mexican cession, which you remember in 1848, which Mexico was still a little bit sour about, which you'd have to understand why. This outraged so when the US found this out, they were outraged. They wanted blood. But the Germans were gambling that they could starve out Great Britain into peace talks before the United States had time to mobilize and react. They were almost correct. So when Woodrow Wilson initially won re-election, he won with the slogan of "He kept us out of war," and he led with humanitarian and democratic values. He said that we needed help. We need to help Europe resist German tyranny and to make the world safe for democracy, which allowed each country to rule itself without outside interference. So he meant that without militarism taking over, they could have democracy, but failed to see the irony when it came to their own imperialism and colonialism. The Zimmerman telegram, I will clarify, was sent from Germany to Mexico, intercepted by the British, then sent to the United States. The United States were mad about it because how dare you speak bad about our country? We all know that telegrams sent to other countries about the United States we did not like. So the United States enters the war in 1917. All right, now we can move on to the next slide with the United States entering World War I. Okay, this is World War I on the home front. We had preparedness. So the U.S. military was hopelessly and almost humiliatingly unprepared for a major war. So they pushed for greater defense expenditures, which they call preparedness, right? So Wilson urged Congress, he urged them to have an ambitious expansion of armed forces, and you'll see this in later the drafts and how much industry is actually flowing throughout World War I. Wilson convinced Congress to pass the National Defense Act in 1916, which increased the regular army to a force of like 175,000 and then approved the construction of 50 more warships. The amount, I'm only telling you these numbers so you can understand like the wealth, to understand like how large like they really wanted to get into this war. All right, maybe not really wanted to. That's kind of, they really wanted to like win this war. USA on top. All right. So now we're going to go in USA in combat. Like it doesn't, all right. I'm going to say that it's not, knowing the specifics about every battle and not a huge deal in APUSH, but it helps to know what warfare was like during World War I, because it was considered to be the first truly industrialized war. We saw it a little bit in APUSH and like the Civil War, how we first saw the beginnings of trench warfare, but we haven't seen nothing like this yet. So we had all kinds of inventions to kill humans on a massive scale. Trenches, fully automatic machine guns, airplanes, poison gas, tanks. I mean, come on. When you pair it with, and like when you think about like the outdated attacks were used by both sides, it's understandable how incredibly costly the deaths were for each side. The U.S. in the Selective Service Act, the Selective Service Act in 1917, which drafted 9.5 million men, and most of the American Expeditionary Force commanded this general. We call him, his name is General John K. Pershing, but people call him Blackjack. Literally, what a crazy nickname to have. He got to France and saw combat by early 1918. For the first time, U.S. troops were being shipped overseas in late 1917, and by that point, millions of European soldiers had already died in trench warfare, and because of the heavy artillery and like the industrial age, and the Germans were exhausted because they too have suffered massive losses. So, but the American soldiers that were sent tipped the scales in favor of the Allies. There was one specific battle that I personally didn't remember for my test, but I think it might come up. It was the Meuse Argonne. It was Argonne. Think of it as Miss Saigon. I don't know. Between the U.S. and Germany, which forced Germany into an armistice where we had the Treaty of Versailles. All right. I skipped all the way to the end of the war. My fault. I got a little excited. And so I want to talk about more about the propaganda, like the propaganda that you see on the slides, like the War Industry Board, the Food Administration, and the National War Labor Board. These were all made to like fuel the war on the home front. We had whole committees, like the Committee on Public Education, to make propaganda that sent out all these posters. Like I know y'all see the one that says "Destroy the Mad Brute." I guarantee, like I know we all saw it. I hate that one, but it's very important. We also had the Food Administration, which encouraged American households to eat less meat and bread, so more food can be shipped abroad. It paid off, and the U.S. shipment of food tripled. The National War Labor Board, which was from former President William Howard Taft, which settled disputes between workers and employees, and the head of the National War Labor Board, they won concessions during the war that had earlier been denied. So we see in this time period wages rising, the 8-hour day become more common. Like let's remember this time, like how work days were before this time. And union membership increased. We love our unions. We love them. Join one. On the War Industry Board set production priorities and established a centralized control over raw materials and prices. And also in this time, we also see like a greater anti-German sentiment. We have Frank Little of the Industrial Workers of the World and Robert Prager getting brutally assassinated and murdered on the suspicion of they were German, but they were murdered from being German. And from this, we also see like the risings of the Red Scare, which I'll get to later in some slides. And we also see this is like what I like to call the United States versus the entirety of free speech. We could probably connect this to how Federalists were trying to take away free speech, or how Federalists are trying to take away the free speech with some earlier Supreme Court cases and whatnot. But we have Eugene v. Debs, who is a person, not a court case. I thought I made the mistake of thinking Eugene v. Debs was a court case. He was not. He was a guy who was imprisoned on his anarchist and communist takes. And we also have Schneck. Am I crazy? All right. Schneck versus the United States, where the Supreme Court ruled against a socialist passing out of like anti-draft leaflets. So it also, the ruling would eventually be overturned, but it called into question whether or not words used in such circumstances would create a clear and present danger. We also have the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which we should be making the connection to the Alien and Sedition Acts. You should be making the connection to the Alien and Sedition Acts, okay? As Espionage Act imposed sentences for up to 20 years for people found guilty of aiding the enemy, obstructing the recruitment of soldiers, or encouraging disloyalty. This was very broad. It could mean anything from publishing a newspaper against the United States, or it could mean anybody possibly avoiding a draft. We also saw the Sedition Act, which imposed harsh penalties on anyone who used disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government, flag, or its armed forces uniforms. Crazy stuff. Crazy. Okay, wait a minute. Now we can go on to the next slide. I believe I did get a little like ahead of myself and explain this. I explained like the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, but I did not explain the reparations of it. Okay, Germany accepted sole blame for the war, right? Germany paid its reparations, gave up its army and its territories, and from this, the United States established the League of Nations. Wilson stated his 14 points, which we should all remember like so vividly. Like you don't understand. So we had Wilson's 14 points, which was the recognition of freedom on the seas, an end the practice of making secret treaties with one another, self-determination of all various nationalities, and the removal of trade barriers. It was a very optimistic plan, and it kind of set the groundwork for establishing the United Nations later down the line after World War II. But it failed, and it's because it did not pass the Senate, and the United States was kind of the glue that was holding it all together. And we saw the United States entering another period of isolationism. Hold on. I think I have to refresh. I'm like freezing so bad. I'm so sorry. Am I back?
Yes.
Heavens, I'm back. Okay. You don't have to know all 14. You don't have to know all 14 points. I put up like the gist of it before. I put all the gist of it on the slides. So we're good. We can move on to the other slide where we talk about the Roaring 20s. Okay, the Roaring 20s. Let me set the scene. It was a great time of economic prosperity for some, don't say all, some Americans, which is why it's called the Roaring 20s. Before World War I, we were a debtor nation. We were owning banks. We were owing banks. We were owing countries in Europe large sums of money. But after World War I, thanks to the United States providing the Allies with so many loans to keep up their war efforts, the United States was a creditor nation. We had huge stockpiles of gold and a powerful economy. It is here we start to see the beginnings of the growth of a consumer society, right? We have advances in technology and production techniques that contributed to the growth of consumer society in America. So you will definitely get an SAQ, a question on that anytime. Like it's not even a joke anymore. Consumer society, remember this. Keep it in your head. Okay. We have Henry Ford's moving of the assembly line, which made it possible to mass produce the Model T car at a price that working class families can also afford. Like, thank you. The distribution system also improved, making it easier for a variety of consumer goods to reach like a wider market. Credit also became more and widely available, allowing people to purchase goods that they didn't even have the money to do up front. And all of these factors, with the rise of advertising and the creation of a culture of consumerism, contributed to the growth of this consumer society in the 1920s. We also saw the assembly line and scientific management, revolutionary methods of production, introduced in this century and had a great impact in the 1920s. For example, the assembly line was invented by Henry Ford and broke down the production process into smaller, specialized tasks that were performed by individual workers. Goods can be mass-produced at a faster rate and lower cost, which made it possible for Ford to sell his Model T automobiles at an affordable price. This was the dominant method of production and led to the creation of many jobs in the manufacturing sector. But this all came at the cost of the exploitation of workers. You see, when you put an emphasis on efficiency and productivity, it required workers to perform repetitive tasks for long periods of time, leading to physical and mental strain. So when they did seek to maximize profits, they also did so by minimizing wages and the work conditions. We also see the birth of like consumer goods in the home. So whenever you're asked about this, it's like radios, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, the Model T car, they were all popular and widely available to the public, right? And there are also new modern marketing techniques that convinced Americans that they needed a particular item, even though they probably really didn't, to solve a problem. Like the marketing of Listerine, one of like the greatest scams of the century, which invented a solution to the newly invented problem of halitosis or bad breath. Okay, so they also use techniques like celebrity endorsements, slogans to persuade people to buy their products. You see this today. You already see this today. Like advertisement in the 1920s is a lot like it is when you see commercials today, except they didn't have a skip button. But the growing consumer culture of the 1920s saw emergences of new forms of leisure and entertainment, movie theaters, and amusement parks. This had a significant impact on the economy and society, which increased the production and consumption of consumer goods. The increase in production of consumer goods led to the economic growth and the creation of new jobs in the manufacturing sectors. You could also say this rising growth in like consumption also contributed to rising in materialism, as Americans focused on having material possessions in American society, as people were encouraged to buy more and more goods to improve their standard of living. We also see like a new national and like regional culture. So the growth of this consumer culture also leads to like a more unified national culture. Like when we see with celebrities like Charles Lindbergh or Babe Ruth, but they also are used to spread harmful racist beliefs. like the racist films like Birth of a Nation, Jazz Singer, which portrayed racist attitudes and stereotypes that had a significant impact on American culture. Birth of a Nation inspired the Ku Klux Klan. All right, remember that. The Birth of a Nation actually inspired the Ku Klux Klan. So they portrayed them as heroes of the Reconstruction, depicted Black people as predatory and dangerous, and it had such influence on American culture and left a very harmful history that we are still dealing with to this day. Pause. Okay, we can keep going. All right, so now we have the 1920s cultural and political controversies. And this is what you've all been waiting for. I'll leave the red scare to the end, okay? This is what you've all been waiting for. So in film, right? Like, because of we have a new wave of immigration and migration brought a diversity of new cultures and traditions to the United States. There was an influx of people from various ethnic and religious and regional backgrounds, that had a significant impact on the arts and literature at the time. Charlie Chaplin was an immigrant movie star. The involvement of Jewish Americans in early film production studios. We have African American pioneers, like we have Oscar Micheaux and Lon Chaney Sr., who made significant contributions to the development of cinema. We also have Latino pioneers like Carmen Miranda or Dolores Del Rio, or we also had like Asian American pioneers like Anna May Wong. Like, how can you forget Anna May Wong, you guys? I love her. And we also saw like new emergences of like new arts and literature that celebrated ethnic and religion and like regional identities. Like this movie, specifically The Kid, like depicts the diversity of American society. Now we're moving into the jazz and the Harlem Renaissance. And so jazz and the blues was a direct result of like one of the Great Migration. So it spread from New Orleans and became popular throughout the country with performers like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and the Okies, which you should remember from you should remember from like a few periods beforehand, which brought from drought-stricken farms in the West, brought country music to California. So the Harlem Renaissance is absolutely an important cultural movement. It took place 1920s and 1930s. It was a moment in history for African American art, literature, and culture. So African Americans at the time were moving from the rural South to the urban North, and I'm seeing all these great migration. It's because of it's because of all this industry that was moving at the time. You remember in World War I, that is why African Americans had more job opportunities up in the North, which is why all of this had like a cultural boom in the 1920s. We had poets, Langston Hughes, who wrote about struggles of African Americans. We had Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote one of my favorite books, Their Eyes Were Watching God, who tells the story of a strong and independent African American woman with Janie Crawford. We also had we saw the emergence of jazz and blues, all music that had roots in African American culture. We had Josephine Baker, who was an African American dancer who rose to fame in Paris, and she was like one of the first African American women to become an international superstar. This Harlem Renaissance was crucial because it produced not only some of the most significant and enduring works of art, music, and literature, but it was also a call to resist racial oppression and continues to inspire artists and activists to this day. There are also large changes Harlem Renaissance countercultural. I have to think about that. I think the Harlem Renaissance was already deeply rooted in a culture of African Americans in the century. It was deeply rooted within the music and the lives of African Americans in the century. I would say it's countercultural to like the white hegemony. but to African Americans, it was nothing new. Okay. Changes for women, and so we have women's suffrage we have women's suffrage for the 19th Amendment. So women were asserting themselves new ways in the 1920s. We all know like the flapper girl, hems were reaching above the knees. Oh my God, you guys, how are our women going downhill? We also saw pushes for the Equal Rights Amendment to be added to the Constitution. And now we're seeing the Scopes monkey trial, which when I first took APUSH, I was more excited for this because it wasn't what I thought it was. I legit thought they put a monkey on the stand. Sorry, guys. So it was the Scopes monkey trial was like a part of this larger regional differences because we saw rifts between like the inclusive urban people and the traditionalist rural people. They often still had like lines between them from the north and south. Weird how sectionalism just continues on to this day, but I digress. So it was one of the most famous trials in the 1920s, where the Scopes monkey trial was a showdown between science, defended by Clarence Darrow, and religion, defended by William Jennings Bryan, over the issue of teaching evolution in public schools. So Darrow put Bryan himself on the stand as an expert on the Bible and called out his hypocrisy in taking the Bible literally. His full testimony can be used as a DBQ. So I recommend finding it and using it and placing it in the context and using it as a DBQ. Oh, I'll get to the Great Gatsby. I'm just about to get to it. So because of this divide, we see like not only because we have a rising rift of modernism, people are feeling empty because come on guys, feeling like things can't give you feelings. So we're going to talk about like the lost generation, where this trial really demonstrated the ways that USA was growing and fracturing. And we had writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote, hold your applause, The Great Gatsby. And we had Ernest Hemingway, who wrote The Sun Also Rises, which rebelled against the consumerism and the optimism of the time. Because since some of them had served in World War I and were pessimistic about the idea of human progress, some just left the United States altogether and joined the other writers in search of meaning in a modern world. This was called the Lost Generation, which I still think is one of the coolest things, like one of the coolest names you could ever give a group of people. So cool. So then we have like the Prohibition Act. I know, cue the foghorns. I get it. All right. Prohibition. So in 1917, the Congress passed the 18th Amendment that prohibited the manufacture of sale of alcoholic beverages. The Volstead Act implemented the prohibition and banned commercial production and distribution of beverages containing more than 1% of alcohol by the time. So rural areas became totally dry. There was a sharp drop in drinking amongst lower classes in the cities who couldn't afford the cost of like bootleg alcohol. But among the middle class and the wealthy, drinking was fashionable. Because when people tell you not to do something, it immediately becomes way cooler. So people smuggled like whiskey and beer from Canada and like stuffed them in their like basements and garages. And Al Capone, which when I read this in my history book, I didn't think he was in history. Oh my gosh. He was a gangster from the Chicago group gang, which fought for the control of the lucrative bootlegging trade. Organized crime became like a big business. So millions were made from the sale of illegal alcohol, and the gangs expanded to like other illegal activities like prostitution, gambling, and narcotics, which also caused further rift and debate in this period. Which also called further movement and debate in this period. Okay. The 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment. So people toast this year to the end of prohibition. We also see, sadly, the return of this KKK. Race relations continue to be an issue in the 1920s. Before the 1920s, the KKK had largely been eliminated because of the actions taken by the Grant administration. But Jim Crow racism in the South and the success of the film The Birth of a Nation resulted in the second KKK, which was much like the first, which targeted African Americans like racial terrorism. They also targeted Jewish people, immigrants, and Catholics. In response to the racism and Jim Crow segregation, African Americans like sought to solve these issues. Like there was Marcus Garvey, who wanted to return back to Africa because he celebrated Black culture, advocated for Black separatism by moving African Americans to Africa, but he also kind of sort of worked with the KKK. So I don't really know about that. I don't know about all that. And you could tell like people like African Americans didn't really want to move all the way up and move to Liberia. So the movement didn't really work, but it's about the thinking behind the movement. It's about the thinking behind the movement. Okay. Now we can move on to like some of the two of the worst presidencies. Like, oh my God. Oh, that's an opinion. Don't quote me on that on like outside evidence. We can move on to the next slide. The presidencies of Harding and Coolidge. So Harding basically signed off on every law the Republican passed, right? He wanted reduction in income tax, increase in tariff rates, and he also established the Bureau of the Budget because he loved his alliteration. Alliteration in this period skyrockets. With procedures, all government expenditures will be placed in a single budget for Congress to review and vote on. Harding ran on a return of a platform, the return to normalcy, which is like kind of the, I want to say like the thesis for this period. It is isolationism, which Americans wanted to return to a pre-war America, deregulation, civic engagement, and isolationism. His presidency was also marked by scandals and corruption like Ulysses S. Grant. So he discovered, like in 1924, like he was a little messy. He discovered that his Secretary of the Interior had accepted bribes for granting oil leases near the Teapot Dome in Wyoming. Taking bribes, you guys? And his Attorney General took bribes for not agreeing to prosecute certain criminal subjects? I don't know about all that. Like, after the scandals were uncovered, Harding died suddenly while traveling out into the West. And then we have, you see how small the section on Calvin Coolidge is? You gotta find things about this man. I have to search. He was nicknamed Silent Cow because as president, he believed it was his absolute job to not govern the nation. It was his job to preside benignly by the nation. Little was accomplished in the White House, except keeping a close eye on the budget. He did not run for a second term. Okay, next slide. Oh, I told you. First Red Scare. We got on the Red Scare. So you know how I mentioned that like Nativism was on the rise during World War I? This is still a continuing trend. We have the first Red Scare, which occurred in June 1919, when anarchists sent bombs through the mail to various government leaders, including Attorney General Palmer's house. Palmer then began the Palmer raids with the help of the newly created FBI, by J. Edgar Hoover. So, in the Red Scare, like there was continued fear of communism, socialism, anarchists, and immigrants. Oh God, not the immigrants! Oh my God, they're so scared. Like what? Okay, whatever. This was also the Bolshevik Revolution, like, directly impacted the first Red Scare too. It was like almost right after that. Think about that. Remember that. So they investigated, arrested, and deported anybody who invited communist, socialist, or anarchist sentiments. Even labor activists like one Emma Goldman. It was a denial of constitutional rights and civil liberties. But given the spread of communism in Russia and the fear of spreading, like, growing social unrest at home, many Americans thought it was necessary to protect their own livelihoods. We also see nativism. We also see nativism growing with like throughout the century when we have the first 1907 the gentleman's agreement with Japan, because Asians were still being largely excluded from immigration. This is all from the Chinese Exclusion Act, Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, the Immigration Act of 1917, which also established what we call the Asiatic Barred Zone, and literacy tests for new and established the Asiatic Barred Zone and literacy tests for new immigrants. None of these laws applied to Latin America, but continued to be a source of important manpower through the 1920s. There was also an act called the National Origins Act of 1924 that reduced immigration to 2% and moved back to the reference full date of like 1890, where the US was even more Anglo-Saxon and full of white Protestant immigrants in northern and western countries. Both laws were designed to keep out undesirable immigrants from southern and eastern Europe. Oh, I almost forgot the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti. Oh my gosh, how could I forget those guys? Okay, so the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti is also like one of the key examples of nativism, where like this nativist hysteria was surrounding this trial, where Italian anarchists were convicted during a highly problematic trial of murder and robbery, and then they were executed in the electric chair. People all around the world protested their executions and saw this as like an example of xenophobia and nativism going too far. All right, we can move on. Now we got to get a little sad, guys. We got to turn it down. We're talking about the Great Depression. All right, so this was the worst. We don't need to know all those acts. You probably just need to know like the National Origins Act. I think that's the one that's most important. Anyway, I digress. It was the worst economic disaster to hit the United States in the history. It had high employment. It had like some of the worst causes of high employment, like almost peaking at 25%, and people were desperate. It was caused, use this acronym BOPS. We have bank failures. Banks ran out of money and everyone was freaking out and running to the bank to withdraw their money. Banks had lack of regulations and also had risky loans. So that was one of the causes. The second one, overproducing. Companies and farmers were overproducing way too many goods. Because when the World War I was over, they were still producing at World War I levels. So when people bought like a car or a new appliance, they weren't going to go be back to the market for that in a while. So like companies kept producing for it anyway. And then consumers became a purchasing reduction, the P, which in short means they weren't buying at the levels companies were producing. And in 1929, we saw the stock market crash, which was the straw that broke the camel's back. And Hoover's response didn't make it any better. Like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for all the Hoover fans in the chat. But all of his problems were initially made worse by the government responses. The Federal Reserve was responsible for controlling the money supply and interest rates, tightened the money supply, then raised interest rates, making it harder for businesses to produce the goods and services, and made it harder for consumers to spend money. And then the government passed the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which raised taxes on imported goods in an attempt to save U.S. industries. But other nations just responded with their own tariffs, and world trade just grounded to a halt. We had things like wage freezes, where we had to give voluntary business deals in order for people to fund public works. Come on, you guys. And then he absolutely refused to give World War I veterans their bonus a few years early, like they requested in their bonus march. So after the Senate rejected their bill, the vets stayed in Washington, living in huts along the Potomac. And the troops responded by blinding them with tear gas and burning their shacks. And people were living in like boxcars and shanty towns, which were named Hoovervilles in the mock of this president. Truly horrible time. Until, and drumroll please, we're all waiting for him. It's the man. Next slide. FDR, the election of FDR. So, Democrats nominated Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was also the cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. Weird thing. And he would pass, like in his first 100 days of office, he would pass what would be called the New Deal. This changed the role of federal government in new ways. Remember this. It expanded it. It changed the alignment of political parties. Of the two major time periods where Democrats and Republicans start to morph into the parties we recognize today. We have FDR's 3 R's. FDR's 3 R's were relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, providing assistance to those who are unemployed, homeless, and hungry. Recovery, creating jobs, stabilizing wages, prices, and restoring the banking system. And reform, the establishment of the Social Security, the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the passage of the National Labor Relations Act, all to make sure that the economic failure that happened in the Great Depression never happens again. We also see alphabet soup programs. You do not have to remember all of them. It is not key that you have to memorize all of these. You just have to be able to recognize them if they ever came up in a document, or be able to use a few of them to describe how the U.S. changed because of the New Deal. We have some of the key ones, though. We have the Social Security Act, which set up a public pension system for the elderly or people with disabilities who were unable to work. We have the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act, which was a board to preside over labor management relations and enable unions to engage in collective bargaining with federal support. It outlawed like a variety of like union busting tactics, and it said whenever majority's company workers voted for a union to represent them, that management would be compelled to negotiate with that union on all matters, wages, hours, and working conditions. This is a win for labor unions. Finally, so they can recruit in large numbers of workers, and it led to a revitalization of the labor union movement. And then we have the Glass-Steagall program, which regulated banks and put dividers between the savings and investment parts of banks. We also see some like criticisms of the New Deal. We have the Huey Long. Oh God. Okay. We have Huey Long and his Share Our Wealth Society, who called for 100% tax rate for all incomes above $1 million and redistribution of those funds to poor people. He was a left-wing populist, and his primary focus was ending the depression for our people, and felt that the New Deal primarily failed out failing businesses, and it was insufficiently radical. And then we had Father Charles Coughlin, who called the New Deal the pagan deal, who appealed to Christian conservative Americans who were against the New Deal. He was famously racist and anti-Semitic, and despite his views, he had like 30 million listeners, and he was famously racist and anti-Semitic, and despite his views, despite his views, he had like 30 million listeners, And he also called the Great Depression a cash famine and called for the nationalization of the Federal Reserve, calling for free silver. And we have Townsend, who proposed giving everyone over the age of 60 a monthly pension of $200 that with the provision that it be spent in 30 days. He was much less of a critic of the New Deal and more of a believer that it needed to go with broader, more direct payments to the public as opposed to federal financing, like financing federal projects. And we get to a little bit of like, I don't like, we also see the court packing plan, which I put on this slide, which was when FDR gets a little iffy. Like, he planned on adding more justices to Supreme Court to get his agenda through and received outraged opposition, even in his own party. Like, Supreme Court upheld most of the New Deal, but FDR backed down from his court packing plan. And after that failure, when the economy started to slow in 1937, FDR's legislative agenda began to slow. But we cannot underestimate the effects of the New Deal. Its programs fundamentally and permanently changed the relationship between citizens and their government. The federal government had grown during the New Deal, and many of its programs, like the Social Security and FDIC, are still implemented to this day. We also have the FDR's policies created the New Deal Coalition, and which is a group of people who usually vote for Democrats, and which with some changes remains the core of the Democratic Party to this day. This group includes African Americans, Jewish people, working class families, and those on the lower end of the economic spectrum. And though the New Deal did little to hurt the economy, U.S. economy on paper, it didn't do significantly good. Like, it's only until we enter World War II do we start to see big economic booms. Like, when Roosevelt scaled back the programs he created, the economy suffered like a recession, which was called the Roosevelt recession, and this was blamed on the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve. We can go. Okay, I'm back. Oh wow, guys, crowdcast. So I'm gonna start now. We're gonna start talking about World War II. So this is before World War II. We have U.S. isolationism and a little bit of optimism. So remember how Harding wanted this return to normalcy, which meant stepping back so much from engagement with Europe. It didn't mean that we didn't engage altogether. We still had colonies overseas and wanted to increase trade with the rest of the world, but we wanted to limit the possibility of future wars through meditation and treaties. For example, the Washington Conference tried to stop naval arms races by establishing a ratio of battleships with the U.S. and the U.K. on top, followed by Japan, France, and Italy. But our secret agenda was to stop the growing Japanese naval power in the Pacific. We also had the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was a promise to countries to never fight in war, which was a horrible foreshadowing for what was coming next. So in this period, we see a rise of totalitarianism. We have Mussolini in Italy, Stalin in the USSR, we have Tojo in Japan, and we have Hitler in Germany. And in the lead up to war, Americans really as the Great Depression worsened and took a hold of other countries, Americans really did not want to engage, right? But Roosevelt promised a policy of the good neighbor towards the nations of the Western Hemisphere, and the U.S. pledged never again to intervene in the internal affairs of a Latin American country. We also see neutrality acts, which passed in the 1930s, which made it difficult for the U.S. to trade in other nations involved in the war to avoid similar economic entanglements to World War II. This was after World War II happened, and the United States wanted nothing to do with it. We wanted nothing to do with it in the beginning. But we also assisted the Allies. As conflict began to escalate, we had to take eventually more direct action. We had the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the British and later the Chinese and the Soviet Union to borrow money and material for the United States to continue fighting against the Axis powers. And the Selective Service Act established the peacetime draft in U.S. history as the country began mobilizing for war. And there's also a pro-Nazi organization that promoted fascist ideology in the United States called the American Bund, and it was eventually disbanded. But it shows like the growth of ideologies were concern of Americans as the country continued to like political landscape and the threat of foreign aggression. And it was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 that the U.S. decides to enter World War II. All right, let's keep going. So we have World War II and mobilization. Wilson, the president at the time delivered a speech demanding that proposed lending money to Britain for the purchase of U.S. war materials. He justified it as a policy of defending the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. He posed it as an ideological war, as the fighter for democracy against fascism. We also mobilized in this area. We sold war bonds. We saw the War Production Board, which controlled war production board, and the Office of Price Administration that controlled war industries and consumer prices, respectively. Wilson was the president. I'm so sorry. We also see the Willow Run factory, which is an example of U.S. industries booming business and far exceeding the production and profits 1920s. Women joined the military as nurses and as non-combat are called WACs, Women's Air Corps, or WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, and WASPs, Women Air Force Service Pilots. And we also saw propaganda like Rosie the Riveter that became a symbol of women taking jobs in defense industries. And we also see the war African Americans, where despite the segregation they faced, African Americans fought with distinction, including Tuskegee Airmen, who were a group of African American pilots who served in the U.S. Air Army Corps. We also saw campaigns like Victory at Home, Victory Abroad, where they thought if they fought in the war, they can then gain more freedoms in the United States. We also Executive Order 8802, which prohibited racial discrimination in defense industries, a step towards ending this racial discrimination in defense industries. War in Mexican Americans, we see the Zoot Suit riots, which occurred when white servicemen roamed Mexican American neighborhoods and attacked Latinx people. And the violence and discrimination faced by these individuals during this time was a reflection of the racism that was prevalent at the time. And also to address labor shortages, we had the Bracero program, which recruited Mexican laborers to work in American agriculture to fill in the missing white workers who were serving in the military. For Native Americans, we have the Navajo Code Talkers who were recruited in the military to serve as communication experts, and they used their fluency in the Navajo language to transmit secret messages indecipherable to the enemy. And in a sad like portrait of American history, we had our treatment of Japanese Americans, where we put Japanese Americans in internment camps, and in a court ruling of Korematsu v. the United States that this Japanese citizen was not considered an American citizen. But despite this immigration, some were able to enlist in the military, like the 402nd Infantry Regiment, composed of largely Japanese Americans. And also, next slide. So now we have World War I in the military. I'm going to skip over like all the European theater stuff and the wars, because that's not what we are really focusing on. What we're focusing on is that the United States and the Britain had wartime partnership. We put priority to the European theater, and we said we want total war, unconditional surrender. There was the Pacific theater where we had the tactic of island hopping, and there's also the Death March in when Japan conquered the Philippines, which was one of the most horrific battles of World War II. We also had Japanese kamikaze or Japanese suicide planes, which caused major damage in the Battle of Okinawa. And then skipping forward to like the end of near the end of World War II, President Harry Truman is elected, but FDR had just died. His plan to end the war was full-scale invasion and to modify the unconditional surrender formula and the secret Manhattan Project, or the atomic bomb. Okay, next slide. So in World War II, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was either surrender or face destruction, right? Because at this point, we'd already released bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was either they surrender or they face destruction, really. So the big three, the leaders of the U.S., Soviet Union, and Great Britain demanded unconditional surrender from the Axis powers and liberate France and the Soviets, and to liberate the France and the Soviets and invade Germany. This was all in the Yalta Conference. Germany was divided in occupation zones. There would be free elections in the liberated countries of Eastern Europe, even though Soviet troops controlled this territory. And the Soviets would enter the war against Japan, which they did as Japan surrendered. A new world peace organization, the United Nations, was formed at the Yalta Conference in San Francisco. After defeating the Axis powers, we have America on top. It was not only the major war power to not suffer fighting on its land, and it lost a relatively smaller number of soldiers compared to some of its allies. Like the USSR lost like 10 million soldiers, while the US lost 418,000. We had the Paris Peace Treaties, which were a symbol of a series of international agreements signed in the French capital, which stripped Italy of its colonies, empire, and territories, reduced its military capabilities, put limitations on Japan's armed forces, land ownership, and said that Japan compensate the nations that it took over the war, and had the Nuremberg trials, which are a series of military tribunals meant to prosecute permanent leaders in Nazi Germany for their war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. And this is another example of U.S. on top. The U.S. just joined the United Nations, which was established right after World War II in the wake of the atrocities of the Holocaust and the devastation of the war. The UN Charter, signed by 51 countries, set out the organization's principles and purposes and the promotion of human rights, peaceful resolution of disputes, and provision of humanitarian assistance. The UN adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which set out the fundamental rights and freedoms that are entitled to all human beings, regardless of race, gender, religion, or any status. The United States joining the UN, unlike most post-war World War I League of Nations, made the UN more successful in its peacekeeping goals. There was the post-1945 economic system, the Bretton Woods Agreement, which pegged all the value of the U.S. currencies to the U.S. dollar and gave the U.S. economic control. It was also a major voice in the World Bank and International Monetary Fund set up by that conference as well. The dollar was the currency of choice and the medium of exchange for much of the world's economy. We also had a nuclear monopoly, and because we were the only country at that point with nuclear weapons, and those weapons were used to face off against a former ally with a large army. Like later, we would use it to face against the USSR, which we began to trust less and less. And U.S. was the most powerful nation by this point because Europe and Asia were largely war ravaged. So all of this, the war-ravaged condition of Asia and Europe, the dominant U.S. role in the Allied victory, and post-war peace settlements allowed the United States to emerge from the war as the most powerful nation on earth. And I think that is all. I think that is all the slides we have. That was the entirety of Unit 7. Please fill out the APUSH night 3 survey. Just click the green button. It should be very bright on the bottom of the screen. Whew. I'm sorry I couldn't get to some of your questions. I had a lot of content to like bulldoze through. But you know, I'm sure like at some point we can answer all your like burning like period 7 questions. But yeah, I could probably take my boba break. Oh, right. Please join us tomorrow where we go over periods 8 and 9. Go over periods 8 and 9, and then we have the finale, and then you all have to go take the test. I'm glad I saw so many new and familiar like names in chat. You're gonna do great on this exam. I promise you, I promise you, you're here, you're gonna do great. Bless you.